I can still feel the weight of that cue stick in my hands, the way the chalky grip seemed to anchor me to something solid while everything else shifted beneath my feet. The rusty anchor wasn't the kind of place I would have chosen to spend a Thursday night. The air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the ghost of 1,000 spilled beers, while overhead fluorescents flickered against neon beer signs that cast everything in shades of amber and electric blue. But there I was, 20 years old and leaning over green felt, trying to pretend my pulse wasn't hammering against my ribs. The pool table stretched before me like a small battlefield, 15 balls scattered in their perfect triangle, waiting for someone to break them apart. Around us, the college crowd ebbed and flowed in waves of laughter and shouted conversations. But all of that felt distant now, muffled by the strange gravity that had settled between Grant and me. I lined up my shot, focusing on the clean geometry of it all. Angles and physics. Simple cause and effect. Things I could understand and control. The cue ball sat perfectly still, waiting for direction, and I drew the stick back with practiced precision. This was familiar territory. Safe territory. Then Grant moved closer. I felt him before I saw him. The way you sense someone stepping into your shadow. His presence had weight to it, something that made the air around the table feel thicker, more charged. When I glanced up, he was watching me with that look he'd been giving me for weeks now. The one I'd been pretending not to notice, even though it made something twist low in my stomach every time. Grant had always been the kind of person who took up space without trying. At 22, he moved through the world like he owned it, all easy confidence and careless charm. Tonight, he wore a faded band t-shirt that hung loose on his frame, sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms that were more distracting than they had any right to be. His dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that looked effortless, but probably wasn't. And when he smiled, which was often, it was the kind of smile that made you want to be in on whatever joke he was telling. But this wasn't his usual smile. This was something sharper, more deliberate. He leaned against the edge of the table, fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the wooden rail, and I could feel him studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I tried to refocus on the shot. The 8-ball sat at an impossible angle, and I need to bank it off the far rail if I had any hope of sinking it. Basic physics. Predictable outcomes. Nothing like the way Grant was looking at me. Nothing like the way my hands had started to shake just slightly around the cue. He moved again, this time coming around to my side of the table. I told myself he was just positioning himself for his next turn, but Grant had never been one to wait patiently for anything. He stepped close enough that I caught the scent of his cologne mixed with beer and something else, something that was purely him. Close enough that when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Winter gets me." The words hit me like cold water, sudden and shocking. My hand froze on the cue, the careful angle I'd been calculating dissolving into nothing. I looked up to find Grant watching me with an expression I couldn't read. His usual smirk was there, but felt different now. Fragile somehow, like it might crack if I looked too hard. He was joking. Of course he was joking. This was Grant, after all. The same Grant who flirted with waitresses and made inappropriate comments during movies and had dated more people in the past year than I'd spoken to. The same Grant who'd been pushing boundaries since the day we met, always testing to see how far he could go before someone pushed back. But something in his voice, in the way he dropped it to that intimate whisper, made my chest tighten. Something in the way he didn't immediately laugh or follow it up with another joke. The way he just stood there waiting for my reaction made me think this might not be a joke at all. The pool hall noise continued around us, a steady backdrop of clacking balls and raised voices and the occasional cheer when someone made a particularly good shot. But it all felt distant now, like we were existing in some separate space where only the two of us mattered, where the only sound that registered was Grant's breathing, slightly uneven, and the rapid thump of my own heartbeat. I straightened up slowly, the cue still gripped in my hands like a lifeline. Grant didn't move away. If anything, he seemed to lean closer, his eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made it hard to think clearly. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across his face, but they couldn't hide the way his expression had shifted from playful to something more serious, more vulnerable. This was the moment I should have laughed. Should have made some joke about his ego, or told him he'd had too much to drink. Should have done anything to break the tension that was building between us like a storm gathering strength. Instead, I found myself studying his face, looking for clues about what he really meant, what he really wanted. We've been dancing around this for weeks now. This thing between us that neither of us have been brave enough to name. The lingering looks, the casual touches that felt anything but casual, the way conversations would veer into territory that felt dangerous and electric. I've been telling myself I was imagining it, that Grant was just naturally flirtatious, that I was reading too much into moments that meant nothing. But standing there in the dim light of the rusty anchor, with a challenge hanging in the air between us, I couldn't pretend anymore. Couldn't pretend that the way he looked at me was the same way he looked at everyone else. Couldn't pretend that when he touched my shoulder or stood just a little too close, it didn't send electricity racing through my veins. I bent back over the table, trying to focus on the shot, but my hands were trembling now, and the angles that had seemed so clear moments before were completely scrambled. Grant remained exactly where he was, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that when I drew the cue back, I had to be careful not to bump into him. The cue ball cracked against the 8-ball with a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should have. I watched it roll toward the corner pocket, my breath held, knowing that this shot would decide more than just who won the game. It would decide whether Grant's words had been a dare, a joke, or something else entirely. It would decide whether I was brave enough to find out what he really meant by them. The ball teetered on the edge of the pocket for what felt like forever, balanced between falling in and rolling away. Like everything else in that moment, suspended between possibility and retreat, between safety and the unknown territory that waited on the other side of Grant's whispered challenge. The 8-ball dropped into the pocket with a soft thud that seemed to echo through my chest. I straightened slowly, the cue still gripped in my hands, and looked across the table at Grant. His expression was unreadable in the neon glow, but something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. I had never been the kind of person who thrived in places like the rusty anchor. The crowded spaces, the noise, the way strangers brushed against you without apology as they pushed toward the bar. I preferred quiet corners of a library, the familiar weight of textbooks, conversations that followed predictable patterns. My friends had to practically drag me out tonight, tired of my excuses about having too much studying to do. You need to get out more, they'd said. Live a little. As if living required subjecting yourself to sticky floors and overpriced beer and music played too loud to think clearly. But Grant seemed to feed on this energy. I watched him now as he chalked his cue with practiced efficiency, the same way he did everything else. Like he belonged here, like he'd been born to navigate crowded rooms and loud conversations with equal ease. When he laughed, which he did often, it was the kind of sound that made other people turn to look, wanting to be part of whatever was amusing him. We'd met 6 weeks ago at a house party I'd reluctantly attended. I'd been standing in the corner, nursing the same beer for an hour, when Grant had appeared beside me with that easy smile and started talking like we'd known each other for years. Most people made small talk about classes or weekend plans, but Grant had immediately launched into a story about getting lost in the campus steam tunnels while trying to retrieve a frisbee that had gone down a storm drain. It should have been annoying, this assumption of instant familiarity. Instead, I found myself drawn into his orbit without quite understanding how it had happened. He had a way of making the mundane seem interesting, of finding humor in situations that would have frustrated anyone else. When he described his professor's habit of wearing the same tie 3 days in a row, or the way his roommate organized the cereal boxes by color, Grant made it sound like performance art. Over the following weeks, our group of mutual friends had started including both of us in their plans, and I'd noticed the way Grant's behavior shifted when I was around. The casual touches that lingered just a moment too long. The way he'd position himself so our shoulders would brush when we sat together. The jokes that seemed to be aimed specifically at me, delivered with a look that suggested they contained meanings I wasn't quite catching. I convinced myself I was imagining it. Grant was naturally charismatic, naturally physical with everyone. The kind of person who hugged hello and goodbye, who touched your arm when he talked, who invaded personal space without seeming to realize he was doing it. I was reading too much into gestures that probably meant nothing to him. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the way he looked at me when he made his challenge had been unmistakably deliberate. There had been weight behind his words, intention that couldn't be dismissed as casual flirtation. He moved around the table now with fluid grace, sizing up his options with the same confidence he brought to everything else. His next shot was complex, requiring him to bank the cue ball off 2 rails to reach his target. Most people would have looked for an easier angle, but Grant had never been one to take the safe route. As he lined up the shot, I found myself studying him in a way I'd been trying not to for weeks. The way his dark hair fell across his forehead when he leaned forward. The concentration that transformed his usually animated features into something more serious, more focused. The careful way he gripped the cue, fingers positioning it with the kind of precision that suggested he'd spent considerable time perfecting his technique. Grant executed the shot flawlessly, the cue ball traveling its prescribed path with mathematical certainty before connecting with his target ball and sending it smoothly into a side pocket. He straightened with a satisfied smile, but his eyes found mine immediately, as if my reaction was more important than the successful completion of a shot. This was how it had been for weeks now. Moments that felt charged with possibility, weighted with things neither of us was saying. I've been telling myself it was one-sided, that I was projecting my own confusion onto innocent interactions. But the way Grant watched me now, the way his smile faltered slightly when I didn't immediately respond, suggested otherwise. The pool hall continued its familiar rhythm around us. Groups of students clustered around other tables, their conversations creating a steady background hum punctuated by the occasional sharp crack of balls colliding. Someone at the bar was arguing loudly about a basketball game, while the bartender polished glasses with practiced disinterest. The whole scene felt both intimate and exposed, private moments playing out in public spaces. Grant chalked his cue again, though it didn't need it, and I realized he was buying time, waiting for me to say something, to acknowledge what had just passed between us. The careful distance we'd been maintaining for weeks was crumbling, and neither of us seemed quite sure how to navigate what came next. I cleared my throat, suddenly aware that I'd been staring. Though we'd been staring at each other while the game waited and the world continued around us, oblivious to the small revolution taking place at our corner table. The silence stretched between us for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Grant's fingers drummed against the wooden rail of the table, a nervous habit I'd noticed during our first conversation at that house party weeks ago. It was one of the few tells he had, this small betrayal of the confidence he wore like armor everywhere else. I picked up my own cue, running my thumb along its smooth surface while I tried to process what was happening. The game had started simply enough. We'd been standing with our group of friends near the bar when someone suggested pool, and Grant had immediately challenged me with that easy grin that made everything seem like a joke, even when it wasn't. At first, it had been exactly what I expected. Grant making elaborate shots that were more about showing off than strategy. Me playing it safe, methodical, the way I approached everything else. We'd fallen into our usual pattern of banter, him teasing me about overthinking every angle, me pointing out when his flashy technique left him in impossible positions. But something had shifted with that whisper challenge. Winner gets me. The words had changed the entire chemistry of the space around us, turning what should have been a casual game between friends into something else entirely. Something that felt dangerous and electric and impossible to ignore. Now, as Grant moved around the table looking for his next shot, every gesture seemed deliberate in a way that made my pulse quicken. When he brushed past me to reach the chalk, his hand grazed my shoulder. When he leaned across the table, he positioned himself so I couldn't help but notice the way his shirt pulled tight across his back. Small things that could have been accidents, except for the way he glanced at me afterward, checking to see if I'd noticed. I had noticed. That was the problem. The rusty anchor felt smaller now, the walls pressing closer as the evening crowd thickened around us. Someone had fed more money into the jukebox, and now classic rock mixed with the steady background noise of conversations and laughter. The air conditioning struggled against the heat of too many bodies in too small a space, and I could feel a thin layer of sweat forming along my collar despite the chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Grant missed his next shot, something that should have been simple for someone with his skill level. The ball rolled wide of its target, coming to rest against the far rail in a position that actually made my next shot easier. He straightened with a frustrated shake of his head, but when our eyes met, I caught something else in his expression, something that looked almost relieved, as if failing had somehow been the point. My turn again. I moved to where the cue ball waited, trying to focus on the angles and ignore the way Grant positioned himself directly in my line of sight. He wasn't being subtle anymore. The casual touches had become more frequent, more deliberate. When I bent to line up my shot, he stepped closer, close enough that I could hear his breathing over the noise of the bar. "You're thinking too hard," he said, but his voice was lower than usual, meant only for me. Sometimes you just have to trust your instincts. The words could have been about pool, should have been about pool, but the way he said them, the way he was looking at me when I glanced up from the table, made it clear we weren't talking about billiards anymore. We were talking about the thing that had been building between us for weeks, the tension that had been growing stronger with every interaction until it felt like a live wire humming in the space between us. I took the shot without really aiming, distracted by Grant's proximity and the way his presence seemed to fill all the empty space around me. The ball connected with its target, but with too much force, sending it careening off the table entirely. It bounced once on the worn carpet before rolling to a stop near someone's feet at the bar. Grant laughed, but it wasn't his usual easy sound. This laugh was shakier, edged with something that might have been nerves. He retrieved the ball and handed it back to me, his fingers brushing mine as he placed it in my palm. The contact lasted longer than necessary, long enough for me to feel the warmth of his skin and notice the way his hand trembled almost imperceptibly. That's when I knew for certain that this wasn't just in my head. Whatever was happening between us, Grant felt it too. The realization hit me like a physical force, making my chest tighten and my breathing shallow. All those weeks of wondering if I was imagining things, of analyzing every interaction for signs that might not exist, and now I had my answer written clearly in the way Grant was looking at me. The game continued, but it had become something else entirely. Every shot was an excuse to move closer, every missed opportunity a reason to lean in and offer advice that we both knew had nothing to do with pool technique. The space around the table felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm when you can taste the electricity on your tongue. Other people in the bar began to fade into background noise. The laughter from nearby tables, the clink of glasses, the steady thrum of conversation. It all became white noise against the intensity of what was building between Grant and me. The only sounds that mattered were his voice when he spoke to me, the soft thud of balls connecting, and the increasingly rapid rhythm of my own heartbeat. When Grant leaned close again, ostensibly to check an angle, but really to invade my space in a way that made my skin prickle with awareness, I realized we had crossed some invisible line. The careful distance we'd maintained was gone, replaced by something raw and honest and terrifying. The transformation was so gradual that I almost missed it happening. What started as a game between friends had become something else entirely, each shot stretching longer as we found excuses to move around each other, to occupy the same space, to test the boundaries of what we could get away with under the guise of casual competition. Grant's next turn took forever. He circled the table twice, chalking his cue with unnecessary precision, his eyes finding mine every few seconds as if checking to make sure I was still watching. And I was watching. That was the problem. I couldn't seem to look away from the careful way he positioned himself, the deliberate slowness of his movements, the way he seemed to be performing for an audience of one. When he finally bent to take a shot, he positioned himself so that reaching past him to retrieve my beer would require me to brush against his back. It was a trap, obvious and clumsy, but effective. When I moved to get my drink, the contact sent electricity racing up my arm. Grant's shot went wide, but he didn't seem to notice. His attention was fixed on the place where my shoulder had touched his spine. The pool hall around us continued its familiar rhythm, but everything felt muffled now, like we were existing in a bubble, where only we could hear each other clearly. The group of college students at the next table over was getting louder with each round of drinks, their laughter sharp and frequent, but it might as well have been happening in another building. The only sounds that registered were Grant's breathing, slightly uneven now, and the soft scrape of chalk against Q-tips. My turn again. I selected a shot that should have been simple, but Grant moved to stand directly behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Close enough that when I drew the cue back, I had to be careful not to bump into his chest. The position was impossible to maintain, but I found myself holding it longer than necessary, caught between the shot I was supposed to take and the awareness of Grant's presence at my back. "Nice form," he said, but his voice was rough around the edges, and when I glanced over my shoulder, his eyes weren't on my cue technique at all. They were fixed on my face with an intensity that made my chest tighten. I took the shot without really seeing it, distracted by the way Grant was looking at me, by the way the air between us seemed to thicken with each passing second. The ball missed its target by inches, rolling to a stop in a position that made Grant's next shot easier. I straightened, but didn't step away from where he stood behind me. Didn't put distance between us the way I should have. Instead, I found myself leaning back slightly, just enough to feel the solid warmth of him on my shoulder. Grant went very still, his breathing shallow, and for a moment we stayed like that, frozen in a tableau that anyone watching would have been able to read clearly. But no one was watching. Our friends had migrated toward the bar, caught up in their own conversations and their own games. We were alone in a crowded room, invisible in our corner by the back wall. Grant moved first, reaching around me to place his hand over mine on the cue. His palm was warm and slightly damp, and when his fingers curled over my knuckles, I felt something shift irreversibly between us. This wasn't accidental contact anymore. This wasn't casual flirtation or friendly competition. This was deliberate and unmistakable and impossible to misinterpret. "Let me show you," he said, but his voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for me. He guided my hand along the cue, adjusting my grip with careful precision, and I let him position my fingers and correct my stance, and lean close enough that his breath stirred the hair of my ear. The lesson had nothing to do with pool technique and everything to do with the way his chest pressed against my back, the way his free hand came to rest lightly at my hip. When he spoke again, his lips were close enough to my ear that I felt them move against my skin. The words themselves didn't matter. Something about angles and follow-through and keeping my eye on the target. What mattered was the way his voice had dropped to that intimate register, the way he lingered over certain words, the way he didn't step away when the lesson was finished. I turned in his arms, a slow pivot that brought us face to face with barely 6 inches between us. Grant's eyes were dark in the neon light, pupils dilated, and when I looked at him, I could see my own confusion and want reflected back at me. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something more vulnerable, more uncertain. He looked like someone standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether to jump. The cue slipped from my nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the sudden quiet between us. Neither of us moved to pick it up. Neither of us stepped back to restore the careful distance we'd been maintaining all evening. We just stood there, close enough to kiss, close enough that I could count his eyelashes and see the slight tremor in his hands. This was the moment where everything could change, where the careful pretense we'd been maintaining could finally fall away and leave us dealing with whatever was really happening between us. But it was also the moment where we could laugh it off, make some joke about personal space or alcohol, and go back to being just friends who occasionally brushed against each other by accident. Grant's gaze dropped to my mouth, then back to my eyes, and I saw him make his choice in real time. I saw the exact moment when Grant's resolve cracked. It was there in the way his jaw tightened, in the slight hitch of his breath, in the way his eyes searched mine, as if looking for permission he wasn't sure he wanted to find. We stood frozen like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, the space between us electric with possibility. The game lay forgotten. Balls scattered across green felt, cues abandoned, chalk dust settling on surfaces that suddenly seemed irrelevant. Around us, the rusty anchor continued its Thursday night rhythm, but we might as well have been alone in the world. The noise of other conversations, the clink of glasses, the distant sound of another pool game starting up, it all faded to white noise against the intensity of what was building between us. I could see Grant wrestling with something, his usual easy confidence replaced by uncertainty that made him look younger somehow. Vulnerable. The armor he wore so effortlessly in every other situation was slipping, and underneath it was someone who looked as confused and terrified as I felt. My last shot had been deliberate, carefully chosen not for strategic advantage, but to end the game. To force this moment, we'd been dancing around for weeks. The 8-ball had dropped into the corner pocket with a finality that seemed to echo through both of us, and now we had to deal with the consequences of his whispered challenge. Winner gets me. I cleared my throat, the sound harsh in the sudden quiet between us. The question that had been burning in my chest since he'd first whispered those words finally found its way to my lips, though it came out rougher than I'd intended. What did you mean by that? Grant's breath caught. For a second, his mask slipped completely, and I saw something raw and honest in his expression. Something that looked like relief mixed with terror, as if he'd been waiting for someone to finally ask him directly instead of pretending the tension between us didn't exist. He looked down, then back up at me, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. Stripped of its usual playful edge, reduced to something almost fragile. Exactly what you think I meant. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything I thought I knew about him, about us, about the careful boundaries we'd been maintaining. This wasn't the Grant who flirted with waitresses or made inappropriate jokes or dated different people every few months. This was someone else entirely, someone who was looking at me like I held the answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask. The admission hung in the air between us, impossible to take back or misinterpret. All those weeks of wondering, of analyzing every glance and touch for hidden meaning, of convincing myself I was reading too much into innocent interactions, they crystallized into this single moment of absolute clarity. I felt something shift in my chest, like a door I'd been keeping carefully locked finally swinging open. All the breath left my lungs at once, and I had to grip the edge of the pool table to steady myself. Grant noticed the movement, his eyes tracking to where my knuckles had gone white against the wooden rail. The space between us felt charged now, like the air before lightning strikes. I could see Grant's pulse jumping at the base of his throat, could hear the slight rasp in his breathing, could feel the heat radiating from his skin even though we weren't quite touching. Every nerve in my body was hyper-aware of his proximity, of the way he smelled like cologne and beer and something else that was uniquely him. He took a half-step closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I've been thinking about this for weeks. About you. About what it would be like if we stopped pretending. The confession hit me like a physical blow. All those moments I'd convinced myself were one-sided, all those touches I dismissed as casual, all those looks I'd told myself meant nothing. They'd been real. They'd been deliberate. Grant had been feeling this too, this pull between us that had been growing stronger with every interaction. My hand was still gripping the edge of the table, and Grant's gaze dropped to where my fingers were white with tension. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and covered my hand with his. His palm was warm and slightly damp, and when his fingers curled over mine, I felt the last of my carefully constructed defenses crumble. This was really happening. After weeks of careful distance and plausible deniability, we were finally acknowledging what had been building between us. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you wanted to jump. Grant's thumb traced across my knuckles, a touch so gentle it was barely there, but it sent electricity racing up my arm. He was watching my face, carefully reading my expression for any sign that I wanted him to stop, that I was going to laugh this off or pretend it was just the alcohol talking. But I didn't want him to stop. That was the truth I'd been running from for weeks, the thing I'd been too afraid to admit even to myself. I wanted this. Wanted him. Wanted to see what would happen if we stopped being careful and started being honest. The weight of Grant's confession settled between us like something tangible, heavy with the promise of change. His hand still covered mine on the edge of the pool table, his thumb tracing absent patterns across my knuckles while he waited for my response. I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the way his usual confidence had been stripped away to reveal something more genuine underneath. This was the moment where I could save us both, where I could laugh and shake my head and tell him he'd had too much to drink, where I could make some joke about his ego or suggest we get back to our friends before anyone noticed how long we'd been standing here, lost in conversation that had nothing to do with pool. It would have been easy. Grant would have let me do it, would have probably been grateful for the escape route. We could have gone back to the careful dance we'd been doing for weeks, all meaningful glances and accidental touches that we could both pretend meant nothing. Safe territory, where neither of us had to risk anything real. But looking at him now, seeing the way his breath caught when I didn't immediately pull away, seeing the hope and terror warring in his expression, I realized I was tired of being careful. Tired of pretending that the electricity between us was imagination, that the way my pulse raced when he was near was just coincidence. The rusty anchor felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing close around our corner table. Someone had turned up the music, and classic rock mixed with the steady hum of conversation and laughter from the growing crowd. But all of that existed in another world now, one where people played games that were actually about winning and losing instead of this careful negotiation of want and fear that Grant and I had been engaged in. His fingers tightened slightly over mine, a question in the gesture. I could feel his pulse where our skin touched, rapid and unsteady, matching the rhythm of my own racing heart. The space between us hummed with possibility, with the weight of a choice that would change everything no matter which direction I went. I looked at Grant's face, really looked at him, and saw past the easy charm he wore like armor to something more complicated underneath. The boy who got nervous and drummed his fingers against table edges, who made elaborate jokes to cover moments when he felt uncertain, who had apparently been thinking about me for weeks while I convinced myself I was reading too much into every interaction. Then stop pretending. The words left my mouth before I'd consciously decided to say them, quiet but clear in the space between us. Grant went very still, his eyes widening slightly as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. For a second, neither of us moved, both caught in the gravity of what I'd just said. Because that's what we'd been doing, wasn't it? Pretending that this thing between us was casual, manageable, something we could ignore if we just tried hard enough. Pretending that the tension crackling in the air whenever we were together was normal, that everyone felt this kind of electricity with their friends. Grant's breath escaped in a sound that might have been a laugh or a sigh, his shoulders sagging as if he'd been holding them rigid for hours. The mask he wore so effortlessly everywhere else finally slipped completely, leaving his expression open and unguarded in a way that made my chest tighten. "I wanted to," he said, his voice rough around the edges. "Stop pretending, but I didn't know if you." He trailed off, but I understood what he was trying to say. The same uncertainty that had been eating at me for weeks, the same fear that this was all one-sided, that we were reading signals that didn't exist. Except they did exist. They were real, and we were both finally admitting it. My hand was still trapped under his against the wooden rail of the pool table, and I could feel the slight tremor in his fingers. Grant, who moved through the world with such easy confidence, who never seemed uncertain about anything, was shaking. The realization did something to me, loosened something that had been wound tight in my chest since this whole thing started. I turned my hand palm up beneath his, threading our fingers together in a gesture that was unmistakably deliberate. Grant's eyes dropped to where we were connected, then back to my face, and I saw the exact moment when he realized this wasn't a dream or wishful thinking. This was really happening. The noise around us seemed to fade even further, until the only sounds that mattered were our breathing and the distant thump of bass from the jukebox. Grant's thumb swept across my palm, a touch so gentle it was almost tentative, as if he was still afraid this might all disappear if he moved too quickly. But I wasn't going anywhere. That was what I needed him to understand, what I was trying to communicate through the simple act of not pulling away. For weeks, we'd been careful with each other, maintaining distances that felt safe pretending that the attraction between us was something that could be managed or ignored. Now, with our fingers interlaced and our faces inches apart, pretense felt impossible. Grant leaned closer, close enough that I could see the way his pupils had dilated, could smell his cologne mixed with the faint scent of chalk dust from the pool table. Close enough that when he spoke, his breath stirred against my lips. "Are you sure?" he asked, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. "Because once we cross this line, I don't think I can go back to pretending you're just a friend." The question hung between us, weighted with implications that stretched far beyond this moment in a crowded bar. This wasn't just about tonight, about whatever might happen next. This was about everything that would come after, about the fundamental shift in how we related to each other, about stepping into territory that neither of us had mapped before. I could feel my pulse in my throat, could hear it rushing in my ears like ocean waves. Grant was still waiting, still giving me the chance to change my mind, to step back from the precipice we'd been approaching for weeks. But looking at him now, seeing the hope and vulnerability written clearly across his features, I realized I'd already made my choice. I'm sure. The words came out steadier than I felt, but they were true. Whatever this was between us, whatever it meant for everything that came after, I was tired of running from it. Tired of pretending that the way Grant looked at me didn't make my chest tight, that his casual touches didn't send electricity racing through my veins, that I hadn't been thinking about this moment for weeks without admitting it even to myself. Grant's eyes searched mine for a long moment, as if he needed to be certain I meant what I was saying. Then something shifted in his expression, the last of his uncertainty giving way to something that looked like relief mixed with wonder. His free hand came up to cup the side of my face, thumb brushing across my cheekbone with a tenderness that made my breath catch. The pool table behind us held the remnants of our abandoned game. Balls scattered across green felt, some still clustered where we'd left them, others rolled into corners and forgotten. The cue sticks lay where we'd dropped them, chalk dust settling on surfaces that suddenly seemed irrelevant to anything that mattered. The game that had started this, that had given Grant the excuse to whisper his challenge, was over in more ways than one. Around us, the rusty anchor continued its Thursday night rhythm, but we existed in our own bubble now. The noise of other conversations, the clink of glasses, the occasional cheer from another pool game, it all felt distant and unimportant compared to the gravity of what was happening between us. We were alone in a crowded room, invisible in our corner by the back wall, finally allowing ourselves to have this moment we'd been circling for weeks. Grant's thumb continued its gentle movement across my cheek, and I found myself leaning into the touch without conscious thought. His skin was warm and slightly rough, and the simple contact sent shivers down my spine that had nothing to do with the bar's air conditioning. This was what I've been trying not to think about during all those weeks of careful distance. How it would feel to let him touch me like this deliberately and without pretense. Then, slowly, carefully, as if he was still half afraid I might change my mind, Grant leaned forward and pressed his forehead against mine. Not quite a kiss, but close enough that I could feel his breath against my lips, could see the way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheeks in the neon light. Close enough that the space between us felt charged with possibility. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, breathing the same air, existing in the same small pocket of space while the world continued around us. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with the physical proximity and everything to do with the walls we were finally letting down. All those weeks of pretending, of maintaining careful distances, of convincing ourselves that what we felt was manageable, it all fell away in that moment. I could feel Grant's pulse where his wrist rested against my jaw, rapid and unsteady, matching the rhythm of my own racing heart. His eyes were closed, dark lashes stark against his skin, and for once he looked completely peaceful. No trace of the restless energy that usually drove him, no hint of the performance he put on for the rest of the world. Just Grant, unguarded and real in here. When he finally pulled back enough to look at me, his smile was different from any I'd seen before. Softer somehow, more genuine. The kind of expression that was meant for an audience of one, private and precious in a way that made my chest tighten with something that might have been affection or might have been something deeper. Later, I would try to remember exactly when we decided to leave. Whether it was something one of us said or just a mutual understanding that this moment was too fragile for the noise and chaos of the bar. But somehow we found ourselves outside, the cool night air shock after the close heat of the rusty anchor. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few scattered cars under the flickering glow of a neon beer sign that cast everything in shades of red and blue. Grant's car was parked near the back, away from the streetlights, and we gravitated toward it without discussion. Not because we had anywhere to go, but because we needed space to figure out what came next. We stood beside his car, close enough that our shoulders brushed with each breath. The silence between us was comfortable now, no longer weighted with unspoken questions. Grant's hand found mine in the darkness, fingers interlacing with a naturalness that surprised me. Such a simple gesture, but it felt like a declaration. "I never thought you'd actually say yes," he said, his voice quiet in the night air. "To the challenge, I mean. Part of me was hoping you would, but I didn't really believe it would happen." I looked at him, taking in the way the neon light played across his features, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the soft curve of his mouth. This was Grant without his armor, without the easy confidence he wore everywhere else. Just a 22-year-old guy who'd taken a risk and was still surprised it had paid off. "Guess you won," I said, echoing his own words from earlier, but they meant something different now. Something that had nothing to do with pool and everything to do with the choice we'd both made to stop pretending. Grant's smile was answer enough. His thumbs swept across my knuckles, a touch so gentle it was barely there, but it sent warmth racing up my arm. We stood like that for a long time, hands linked, neither of us moving to get in the car or go back inside, or do anything that would break the spell of this moment. Because this was what mattered. Not the game we'd abandoned or the noise we'd left behind, but this quiet space we'd carved out for ourselves where honesty was finally possible. Where the thing that had been building between us for weeks could finally exist in the open. The neon sign flickered above us, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the empty parking lot. But neither of us was paying attention to that. We were focused on each other, on the warmth of connected hands, on the promise of whatever came next.